G'day legends, I hope you're having a fantastic day and so far you are having a brilliant weekend. Now legends, we do need to make this video a little bit faster than usual. Lily has booked an Airbnb down the coast. She's already gone, but you guys won't wait for your news and the algorithm, well, we are all a prisoner to it. So legends, what are we going to talk about today? Well, of course, we'll look at the maps, we'll compare maps, see where things are moving, look at the battlefield, look at what's happening with some of these strikes. I'll go over some of the tactics being used. Of course, the big news of the day that's made many people just enraged is then India, Russia, are meeting Putin, Modi in India, and how Modi has welcomed Putin. We'll go over how these large state powers really operate, though, and what they have spoken about. But the main meat of the video, we're going to be looking at the White House has published on their website, if I remember, I'll link it below, the 2025 National Security Strategy. We'll go through that because it has a lot of points about Europe that you and I have spoken about before, but also points about the relationship between the US and Russia and how we've looked at and gone, look, to slow down China's growth, to maintain US regional hegemony or dominance in the system, a relationship here is going to have to be fostered one way or another. So legends, of course, in that, a lot to go over, and a lot of people are not happy with how things are going at the moment. But we'll always tell the truth. We'll always tell the truth as we see it. And if we do make a mistake, we'll catch up on it. So let's start with Russia and India. Now, Putin and Modi, they are having a laugh in the back of a car. And we were speaking about, wonder what they are listening to in there. Maybe a bit of Creed. But they have had a very warm relationship. Modi has given Putin all the stops have been pulled out. Cuddle, red carpet, everything. Now, Modi has said is delighted to welcome my friend President Putin to India. India and Russia's friendship is a time-tested one that has greatly benefited our people. We've agreed on an economic cooperation program until 2030 in order to diversify our trade and investment linkages. We talked about improving connectivity, enhancing relations in shipbuilding, skills, energy, critical minerals, and much more. You need to remember that India is a massive country with an unbelievable population that is growing very quickly. Putin, he emphasized that Moscow is ready to ensure uninterrupted oil supplies to India. We know this secondary sanctions, all the talk about if India can stop buying Russian oil, what we've said is what other choice then is on the table. Now, there was no defense deal announced, but there is plenty of rumors going through the rumor mill, from Su-57 fighter aircraft to submarines and everything in between. And this is the balancing act that India plays. They are the great global balancer. They balance between West, the global South. They balance between balance between Russia and the US, the Europeans, and even more recently, the Chinese. They do this for the three pillars of sovereignty between trade, military, and of course, their energy supply. So no single one of those pillars can really be shattered by one state. This is what we've spoken about of the sovereignty of a state like Germany has actually decreased due to this war, because at least it could balance one of those pillars against the US, so military reliance on the US, but with their energy from Russia. And now that it's gone all to the US, that's increased the power of the US. It doesn't mean ideologically it wasn't the right decision, but on an absolute realpolitik level, it is a concern. We'll speak about that later. Now, both have expressed that they're looking for new markets. Putin, of course, for his oil to do with sanctions and, of course, tariffs around the world too. And Modi wants to increase trade into countries like Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan as well. Now, of course, this has enraged many people. We see people like this Mr. Jogan saying, F India. You're welcoming the worst mass murderer since Hitler. Now, firstly, what I would say is please go and look at some figures. You'll be absolutely shocked. Now, this war is bloody, it's brutal, it's catastrophic. But at the end of the day, this has had relatively a very low civilian casualty rate compared to other wars. Each one of that is an absolute catastrophe. It's a tragedy. But what you're doing is you're obviously going European casualties far more than others. And what I'll say is, Mr. Go look at Pol Pot, Mao, Bush, Blair, Please go and have a look. Putin has visited India for the first time since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion following negotiations with the US and a visit from the Chinese in Moscow. He continues his diplomatic tour. In India, he's greeted with dancing and hugs, as most world leaders are. Now, this bloke, he's a good example of the meltdown that we're seeing. When Trump meets Putin, it's historic. If Modi does, we see this. Suddenly, we see that India is responsible for all of Russia's actions, both past and present. Now, these people, they'll speak about sovereignty, independence for a state to choose their own path, their area of the world, and engage diplomatically as they see fit. But they'll have a meltdown if it isn't the right path, the approved path, the path of which they agree with. And this is much like freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is not tested when you support someone of which you agree with. Freedom of speech is tested when you support someone of which you don't agree with. You don't agree with what they've said, but you have the right to say it. Now, Modi has responsibility first and foremost to his state, rise on the Tat, and 1.43 plus billion people, and to balance the West so they become a vassal of this. Now, how many times have we worked with bad guys to secure a favourable outcome for our people or for our area of the world? I'm not saying it's right, it's just how large-scale great power politics works. Charles de Gaulle, he says international politics is a matter of grim realities. Sentiment has no place in it. George Kennan, he says, you have no idea how much it troubles me when people expect moral clarity from foreign policy. And there's an unknown quote here, a leader first owes loyalty to his people, not the expectations of outsiders. Modi, at the end of the day, he's at the helm of a massive growing state that will likely become, in our lifetimes, or maybe not mine with the old tumour, but in your lifetimes, hopefully, we'll see it become a great state player outside of where it already is. Now we're going to look at the maps and then we'll get into that US strategy. Here is Ukraine in the centre of your screen, the capital of Kyiv. Red areas occupied since 22, purple since 2014. And I found this interesting. It was from a few days ago, reported here by Ukrainian media, is basically a member of parliament, an MP, or National Security, Defence and Intelligence, Roman Kostenko. He has said that Ukraine needs to double its mobilisation rate. They're saying there's 30,000, but what we really need is to double this 40, maybe 50,000. And speaking, the mobilisation effort is still far below. Thing is, at the moment, this is scraping by at best. To double that, well, we will see. It does speak of it's not being stabilised with the current rate. You need double of it. My question is, where's that coming from? Again, I'll say once again, Zaluzny was correct for what he was ultimately pushed out for. Let's come down into the south. The south is the area that's concerning me the most. Now, on this map, any red check that you'll see, this is ground that Russia has made. Now, no movements down on the south on this map today, but I want to talk about Guliopol. We see Guliopol is the largest area before you get to somewhere like Kyiv as this sweeps around and starts getting enveloped. And what we're seeing here is, once again, exactly how Russia take areas. Hold, attrit, destroy, exploit. And we see in Guliopol it's being absolutely shattered by FAB glide munitions of all different variants at the moment. You can go and look at all the footage of it. And if you just want, you can read through this slide. I'll zoom in on it if you want a screenshot and go through it. But this is what we see the Russians doing. There's a video on my channel where I talk about this. They build the flanks. They hold the forces inside of an area with drones. They destroy with traditional fires from FABs to artillery to everything in between. You neutralize with larger systems like your TOS, and then you have that chaos and accumulation using the DRGs on the base within the area. We saw this really good example in Pokrovsk. You exploit then with fires beyond, so the routes in and out, of course, because you're looking for attrition before you're looking for kilometre squares territory. You close up the area if you can. You can do this operationally enveloping, especially now in the age of drones, and you're trying to reintroduce an element of mechanized maneuver, of which we have seen little glimpses of what may be to come around Novopavlivka and Malotokmachka, but we haven't seen an ability to actually reintroduce that yet. Now, let's just push while we're down in this area into then Kyiv, Malotokmachka. I believe we have a Suryak map in here, but I'm just going to have to find it in my maps here. Maybe I'm incorrect. Sorry, we do have one right in here. So we see on Orikri front in the last 2 weeks, Ukrainian army has gradually regained control of the central part of Malatokmachka. Of course, this map is only showing grey zone in the eastern outskirts of this. Now, while we're in this sector, Mariupol has not moved. We'll come then Velika Novosilka. We push north and we have Ivanivka, Novopavlivka, 2 areas absolutely to keep an eye on. You can see the blue in here. This blue was confirmed by all the other maps as well, where Ukraine has pushed back, where Russia was at one point in Ivanivka. Now, of course, this blue showed areas of which were never red. So can we assume that the Russians were in control of the majority of Ivanivka at some point? But Suryak, he's saying this. On this front, locality of Ivanivka is located in a large grey zone. Russian army infiltrated the streets again through the forest areas. So, of course, he showed that they were back to then the river that runs through, but now they've made a push back. So we see a bit of elasticity on this front line. Novopavlivka, just to the east of here. We saw that first mechanised assault using fog for a very long time. And we have definitely seen accumulation of Russian forces in Novopavlivka. But he's saying today Ukrainian army launched a counterattack and managed to regain the positions lost in November north of the locality. So in the northern sector up in here, still not even shown in grey, that they've managed to retake some areas there. Now, let's push into Pokrovsk. We see Minograd front. We see a little bit of red out of Moskovsky in here. But, of course, this is just squeezing down on this sector. But according to Suryak maps, this has further deteriorated already from the catastrophic situation of what it was. What I've been speaking about is in and out of here. This has been what's concerning me the most. So a map like this will show it as like a little pincer. But what we've seen is building Horshny, Rodyansky, making more of like a tunnel to get out of here. Of course, makes any logistics in or out, evac, whatever, more and more difficult, if not impossible. And we see then Suryak saying this situation in Pokrovsk. Last 2 days, Russian army secured the pig farms north of Pokrovsk city, as well as adjacent trench line. So we can come in. These are the pig farms right in here. And he's saying that these pig farms all the way up to Rodyansky, so just trace where my cursor is at the moment, that all of, actually I'll draw it in, that like all of this area is further coming under control. And you've got a more significant tunnel to be able to get in and out of here if possible at all. Definitely operationally encircled. There's argument as to whether it is physically encircled like these maps show or not. I think it's highly likely that it is, but I say regardless of if there is Ivan or Stefan Druk sitting there, it is encircled in a war like this with artillery and drones. We see at the base of Minograd, the Russian army is taking more areas according to Suryak maps. Interestingly, shows where this red check is, so that would likely be the case. Then we come to the north of him. We're looking for Nikolaevka, Ivanivka. This is on that northern push that we saw out towards Zoloty Kolodiyaz. That has been mostly pushed back. But we have seen Suryak AMK speaking, there's been a lot more movements around here by the Russian forces recently, recapturing new positions south of Nikolaevka. So if we zoom in, he's saying down to the south of here, new positions as well as Dorozhny, that the other mappers are saying is back under Russian control. And they're actually building on this northern aspect at the moment between Sofivka, Shakovka and Novoshakovka. So absolutely an area that we'll keep an eye on and see how that develops over the next coming weeks or months, especially as the colder weather hits. Colder weather may slow down the front line, but it also may increase the efficiency, the effectiveness, the lethality of weapon systems that hit stationary targets. So things like artillery, things like drones, and somewhat drones, but especially things like FABs are a lot more effective against a stationary target. The front line slows down and you've got an enveloped area, can't move, and you're just having those Su-34s, which are unaffected by all but severe weather. It can become more and more deadly. Let's continue moving up. We'll come to Seversk. A lot more red check in and around to the east and southeastern side of Seversk, as well as to the southern Fedorivka, Perezhny area. Again, still well outside of a lot of the geolocation we've seen up here, but you can see this Seversk envelopment continue to grow. Now, we do have one map on here from Suryak, and he's speaking about further break-ins into Seversk, into some of the high buildings east. They're saying were taken all high buildings. We know whether it was battles with horses and swords, high ground is very important, especially now. It's still important for fires, but it's also important for your electronic warfare, your radio repeaters, all of this stuff. So he's saying those areas. And again, he's showing movement in the area that this map is showing movement will confirm movement into the eastern part of Seversk. Now, let's continue up. We have, of course, Yampil, Liman, Stavke. So let's have a look. Dobrasheve area. And this is where Syriac is showing some movement. During the last 4 days, Russian army secured completely the northeastern outskirts of Dobrasheve. Now, these maps show a lot different, but he's saying northeastern outskirts, Dobrasheve coming under control. Remember, Stavke as well. We know that there's definitely fighting in this area. It's definitely grey zone. It may be split 50-50 between red and blue at this point in time. Let's continue up into the north, into Kupiansk. And this is an area of which Syriac is saying is difficult to know. It's a mess and a headache, similar to the Shukhovka salient. Of course, that was the northern side of Pokrovsk. It was very hard to get an idea what is actually happening there. This map not showing any changes, but Syriac, AMK, they are. Northeastern front from the last 3 days, Ukraine army continued to regain territory west of Kupiansk, taking advantage of the porous front to reach this street. Operations expanded further, reaching these areas, and there was a withdrawal by some of Ukrainian troops back from the railway. So up into this sector here that Ukraine had been pushing in. We've seen this from AMK and Syriac. This map hasn't shown anything on these updates, but I'll be interested to know what Kupiansk actually looks like, especially as the Russians in the northern sector have really been pushing hard in Vovchansk, confirmed by all of the maps. Right, let's get into the meat of the video. Now, I'll try and link it below, but if I forget, just Google White House National Security Strategy. It's been out for about 19 hours. You'll find it as soon as you start looking, I am sure. Page 25 to 27 is what interests me the most due to this is what we speak about on this channel. And we speak about this growing gap between where the US, where Europe is sitting. We criticize internal European politics. In 50 years, if the EU falls apart in the coming decades and we see living standards continue falling, what won't happen is the history books in 50 years won't say it was Vladimir Putin's fault. They won't. They will say it's Merkel, it's von der Leyen, it's Callas, it's Macron and his husband. That's what the names will be in decades to come. Let's have a look at this. In section Charlie, promoting European greatness. American officials have become used to thinking about European problems in terms of insufficient military spending and economic stagnation. There is truth to this, but Europe's real problems are even deeper. So American officials, this is just how we see Europe. And I don't disagree with seeing economic stagnation. Look at companies that have a market value of over $100 billion that have been raised in Europe in the past decades. Look at then military spending is just fallen apart. And even these targets of 2%, 5%, if they're met, it's met with then very good accounting on the books of, well, this bridge actually, that's part of our military then might. Continental Europe has been losing share of global GDP, down from 25% in 1990 to 14% today, partly owing to national and transnational regulations that undermine creativity and industriousness. Just bureaucracy, red tape to get anything done. And just look at trying to build more shells or tanks or whatever for any sort of reasonable cost. It's cheaper just to buy them back off other states. But this economic decline is eclipsed by the real and more stark prospect of civilizational erasure. The large issue facing Europe include activities of the European Union and other transnational bodies that undermine political liberty, sovereignty, migration policies that are transforming the continent and creating strife, censorship of free speech, and suppression of political opposition, cratering birth rates and a loss of national identities and self-confidence. Now, there is a lot in that. We're not going to go right into that yet. They are talking a lot about immigration, freedom of speech, undermining democracy. But what we're going to look at is we're going to link that paragraph specifically to a study done, funded by the US in 2019, about what may be the outcome of expanding or extending Russia and trying to push NATO out. There's a lot that lines up in this. Should present trends continue, the continent will be unrecognisable in 20 years or less. I think to many, it's unrecognisable from a decade ago. The first time I visited France was in 2017. I visited France again in 2023, and it was very different from how I remember. As such, It's far from obvious whether certain European countries will have economies or military strong enough to remain reliable allies. So in 20 years, if this continues, can we really rely on you as an ally? Again, this is the fractures in NATO that I've said. This war wanting Russia wanting to decrease Ukraine's ability to be a state and have war. However, that's why war is used as a tool of politics. If it ends up that there's fractures in NATO and the Europeans in these institutions, that's a bigger win than Putin's wet dreams. Many of these nations are currently doubling down on their present path. We want Europe to remain European, to regain its civilizational self-confidence, to abandon failed focus on regulatory suffocation. So, of course, everything is just going overseas. And what we're seeing, though, we see this in Europe. I didn't read the complete article, but there was policy getting put through one of the European states' parliaments at the moment that was trying to make it illegal to work with a lot of Chinese industrial manufacturers, but they were doing it through policy that will never work. What you need to do is make it, therefore, competitive. You're not going to be able to out-policy your way out of this by more and more and more rules, because you'll always find a way around that, or other growing markets. I think that's a good example of what's happening. This lack of self-confidence is most evident in Europe's relationship with Russia. European allies enjoy a significant hard power advantage over Russia by almost every measure save nuclear weapons. So hard power from tanks to, well, I was going to say bullets and bombs, but that's definitely not true. But in your hard power is more powerful other than nuclear weapons. But what we see is this scares the shit out of them. As a result, Russia's war in Ukraine, European relations with Russia are now deeply attenuated. The many Europeans regard Russia as an existential threat. Managing European relations with Russia will require significant US diplomatic engagement, both to re-establish conditions of strategic stability across the Eurasian landmass and to mitigate the risk of conflict between Russia and European states. So we're going to have to work in between these two. It is a core interest of the US to negotiate expeditious cessation of hostilities in Ukraine in order to stabilise European economies, prevent unintended escalation or expansion of war, re-establish strategic stability with Russia, as well as to enable post-hostilities reconstruction of Ukraine to enable its survival as a viable state. So saying we need to end this war, not just to rebuild Ukraine and survive as a state, but to stabilise your economies, not leading into further war, which I believe at this point in time, the European leaders, they know no other path that doesn't currently lead to war with Russia. This is something I've spoken about over the past years, is especially now under a Trump administration. The US and Russia are on more similar paths than the US and Europe is. Regardless of this war, regardless of how even this war ends, that relationship between the US and Russia will continue, and I believe it will continue to grow, and a lot of that has to do with trying to slow at least the rise of China. The Ukraine war has had the perverse effect of increasing Europe's, especially Germany's, external dependencies. Today, German chemical companies are building some of the world's largest processing plants in China, using Russian gas they cannot obtain at home. The Trump administration finds itself at odds with European officials who hold unrealistic expectations for the war perched in unstable minority governments, many of which trample on basic principles of democracy to suppress opposition. And we see this again and again. The foundations are being eroded because of these unrealistic expectations. A large European majority wants peace, yet that desire is not translated into policy because it's ideologically existential for a lot of these other governments and leaders, ideology, all of that. In a large measure because those governments' subversion of democratic processes. This is strategically important to the United States precisely because European states cannot reform themselves if they are trapped in political crises. Yet, Europe remains strategically and culturally vital to the US. Transatlantic trade remains one of the pillars of the global economy and of American prosperity. Europe is home to cutting-edge scientific research and world-leading cultural institutions. Not only can we not afford to write Europe off, doing so would be self-defeating for what this strategy aims to achieve. That said, a lot of that is now just going overseas. seas. And there's very few areas of which still remains world leading, but is absolutely in some areas and could, as this is saying, be saved with help from the US. American diplomacy should continue to stand up for genuine democracy, freedom of expression, unapologetic celebrations of European nations' individual character and history. Go back to what J.D. Vance said at the Munich Security Conference, go through at the moment of the EU then fining X for things posted as well. Our goal should be to help Europe correct its current trajectory. America is understandably sentimentally attached to the European continent. Again, sentimentally attached. Remember, great powers, they only have strategic interests. They do not have permanent friends or enemies. There was a time where America and Iran were incredibly close friends as well. Of course, Britain and Ireland, the character of these nations is also strategically important because we count upon creative, capable, confident, democratic allies to establish conditions of stability and security. We want to work with aligned countries that want to restore their former greatness. It's so funny how it's Americans and a lot of Australians are more patriotic about Europe than a lot of the European elected officials are. Now, over the long term, it is more plausible that within a few decades, at the latest, certain NATO members will become majority non-European. Of course, he's speaking here about immigration. As not only immigration, but then within different ethnicities, far higher fertility rates. That's something that is not very spoken of, is even if immigration was turned off in some of these states, one ethnic group is having 6 children and one ethnic group is having 0.7. As such, it is an open question whether they will view their place in the world or their alliance with the United States in the same way as those who signed the NATO Charter. So are they going to see it the same? And this is something I've spoken about, was to say there's a massive change in the culture, the ethnic status, however, of these countries. It may remain democratic, but may seek then different alliances or outcomes. Our broad policy for Europe should prioritise re-establishing conditions of stability within Europe and strategic stability with Russia. So I'm not talking that we're singing Kumbaya, but there's stability with the largest nuclear power on Earth. And not a war that's going to kill hundreds of thousands or millions of more patriotic Europeans. A war of that scale would be disastrous to what Trump is talking about here of Europeans, would be absolutely disastrous, because what you're going to get is you're going to get patriotic young European men signing up and will destroy all these figures and these predictions of the future of how long it's going to take for some countries to swing will be sped up by centuries. Enabling Europe to stand on its own feet and operate as a group of aligned sovereign nations, including taking primary responsibility for its own defence without being dominated by any adversarial power. So you have to act as a sovereign nation, but you have to be aligned, which we see there's no alignment. Frozen funds is a good example of this, but you are taking responsibility for your defence. You're not just sucking on the teat of the American military-industrial complex and their nuclear weapons coverage. Cultivating resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations. So where you're going, saying we don't want that. European markets to US goods and services, building up healthy nations of Central, Eastern and Southern Europe through commercial ties, weapons sales, etc., ending the perception and preventing the reality of NATO as a perpetually expanding alliance. This is a big one. Is the perception, reality of NATO expanding, ending that. Of course, Russia will like to hear that being said in this. Encouraging Europe to take action to combat mercantilist overcapacity, technological theft, cyber espionage, and other hostile economic practices. Now, this, I believe, is aimed directly at China. When we look at cyber espionage, tech theft, these actions, this is massively through universities, through some manufacturing hubs, through some tech areas, back through into China, saving them tens, if not hundreds of billions on a lot of R&D. We do know the Soviets, they were very, very good at this. The Soviets were very good at then stealing R&D from the US and then producing something that is an analog without having to spend all the billions and all the testing and all of that. A lot of fighter aircraft are great examples of this. We know that through old KGB GRU documents as well. Now, take those 3 slides that I've just shown you. Let's go back to 2019 and look at this, then written by Rand, of extending Russia, competing from advantageous ground. Now, I haven't written anything in here. All I've done is I've pulled out direct quotes from this, and you'll be able to get an idea of how the US is written today, what we saw back then, as outcomes of what could happen on current trajectories and further instability on the eastern flank of NATO. More vocal US advocacy of NATO membership for Ukraine would likely strengthen both Ukrainian morale and Russian determination to prevent such a development, thereby perhaps further extending Russia's commitment and costs. Such a move would also engender opposition within NATO, detracting from what otherwise has been a rather unified front in opposition to Russian aggression. And of course, we see those fractures grow and grow. So this is what they're saying as risks in this. Possible Russian response to such deployments on its borders could vary widely. Greater efforts to destabilise the NATO members hosting the deployments, horizontal escalation, placement of strategic forces on heightened alert, heightened attempts to destabilise Western political systems. Although there may be absolutely attempts to destabilise Western political systems, trust me, I think the SVR would be sitting back going, Jesus, you're doing this yourselves, guys, way more than, like, we wish we were this effective. I think they'd be sitting there going, we wish we were this effective. Yeah. These policies are able to prompt a strong Russian response precisely because they threaten Russian regime security and command and control systems. And in doing so, they have the potential to undermine strategic stability and increase the risk of direct conflict. So by these policies threatening the regime, they risk direct conflict. Russia might counter-escalate, committing more troops and pushing them deeper into Ukraine. This could produce disproportionately large Ukrainian casualties, territorial losses, refugee flows. It might even lead Ukraine into a disadvantageous peace. Increasing US military aid would certainly drive up the Russian cost, but doing so could also increase the loss of Ukrainian lives and territory or result in a disadvantageous peace settlement. Despite these difficulties, limited effects on Russian domestic stability and international image could be achieved by Western information campaign that helped to undermine key aspects of the regime's claim to legitimacy, worked in tandem with pre-existing regime vulnerabilities on such issues as corruption. However, such a strategy would be risky. Western involvement in Russian politics in this manner could give the regime both cover and incentive to institute a violent crackdown on domestic anti-regime groups and activists. It might also lead Moscow to expand its already considerable efforts to destabilise democratic systems. This approach might initiate a second ideological Cold War between Russia and the West, with de-escalation could be difficult. And this is one of those, you've got the crystal ball looking into the future of what we have seen. And I think we've brought this up before, but it's incredibly interesting then when we go through these slides from the national security strategy, what the US is saying. Now, we're going to tie all this together with something that Mr. Henry Kissinger said back on September 7th, 2014, of course, regarding Ukraine and the initial movement in. Now, he says in this interview, we need an outcome that does not make the West appear weak, and Russia needs an outcome that does not make it appear humiliated. Can one find a passage between this? We cannot permit a country to be dismembered like Ukraine, but we should do it in a manner that keeps open the possibility that Russia joins an international system rather than put in a position where it feels totally outcast. And I think this sums up well, of course, Mr. Rubio is on this same interview as well, a lot of what this strategy brings together, the risks and outcomes of what this said we may see, together with what we are seeing growing within Europe. Do I believe the oil tanker of politics, because you start steering the wheel away from an iceberg, and if you've seen it, you're going to hit it. Do I think that Europe is going to be able to turn this wheel and swing out of the way and not hit the iceberg and do Titanic Mark II? No, I don't think the majority of European states can. I think, though, what we'll see is the ones that can starting to question their position in some of these alliances. Now, the ones I believe will question this the most will be Germany. At the end of the day, without Germany, the EU has nothing. 40% GDP, 90 plus million people. You've already had the UK leave. The UK, that's a whole nother disaster waiting to occur. But how does that look following this? Where does Germany move with the more, say, conservative, patriotic government? How does that appear to the outside states? This has been one of my predictions long term, is I believe that once again, and there's plenty of historical reference to this, we will see tensions within European Union states, countries within Western Europe, tensions increasing again. To the point of war? I believe not. We all know the cost of war is too high. But Germany is rearming massively. They still can, under the right governance, create a huge military power. What will this do? Well, states balance power against military power. They don't do it against then initial policy or war outlooks. Okay? You're doing it against what does my neighbour have? We need to balance it against this, not what do they want to do. Why? Because what they want to do under the government can change remarkably quickly. At the end of the day, that is how realist, behind the curtain politics of military then works. And if you saw Germany go up and go, we just can't be part of this anymore. We just can't keep just lifting up Estonia and Latvia and Romania. We just can't keep doing this at the detriment of our own state. And we saw that move out, but they've, because of this war, have militarized massively. How does that look to the states around them? Germany might be going for a third loss. No, we'll see. Legends, you look after yourselves. You have a great day. I'm going to go edit this, jump in the car, and get down to the coast. Look after yourselves. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.